Hello. In the recent past, the inhabitants of the state of West Bengal witnessed a hawker eviction drive conducted by the Indian Railways as well as the state government of West Bengal. And this hawker eviction resulted in two kinds of narratives among the electors, the voters, the citizens of this state. One set of people thought that hawker eviction is not necessarily a good thing, and the basis of their argument is that these hawkers have been illegally occupying government lands, public lands, and therefore these people can be legitimately removed from these places. On the other end of the spectrum, we see people who sympathize with the hawkers who faced these eviction drive, lost their means of livelihood, and for these second category of people, there is one solution that could be made available to the hawkers who faced eviction, and that is rehabilitation. Both the groups, I believe, share one particular mode of thinking. Both the groups, those who support the eviction process, those who are opposed to the eviction drive, think that if development has to happen, it has its own aesthetic, spectacular manifestations. And just as the logic of development, the discourse of development, is now a part of our collective common sense, especially among the educated middle classes of this state, and we can see corresponding socio-cultural, economic categories in different other parts of the country and beyond. So most of these educated middle class people think that the logic of development is an unquestionable one. And in that sense, it is part of our common sense, as if development has to happen at any cost. And at times, this cost is visibly providing us with some tragic situations. Those innumerable videos circulated on different media platforms, social media platforms, of hawkers crying profusely, some of them committing suicide, some of them desperate to look for other means of livelihood, to feed their children. When we see these videos, we see tragic tales of people who lost their means of subsistence overnight. And we feel bad, some of us feel bad about it. But we don't necessarily question the logic of development itself. We think the roads of the cities are not to be occupied illegally or otherwise by anybody, by these hawkers. Therefore, the hawkers on different parts of the city are to be removed. Those people who are opposed to the way hawkers are being removed from their places of livelihood are only opposed to it because they think these people should be provided with some means of livelihood, some alternative allocation of land and other facilities that are needed for them to successfully carry out their business ventures. So the first point that we need to take home is that we are not, whether we support the Hawkeye eviction drive or not, we are not opposed to the very logic of development, which is in this particular case premised upon a manifestation in spectacular terms of that logic of development. We're not opposed to that. And as I was thinking of this situation and how most middle class people were responding to the hawker eviction drives, I went back to a book that I'm very fond of reading. And at the same time, I was reading Professor Partha Chatterjee's recently published book, For a Just Republic. So some of my thoughts in this video are to some extent influenced by my readings of Chatterjee's book, For a Just Republic, and the book that I have been going back to in several such occasions whenever I find any political crisis in the South Asian subcontinent. I often have this habit of going back to this wonderful book by Kalyan Sharnal called Rethinking Capitalist Development, Primitive Accumulation, Governmentality and Post-Colonial Capitalism. It is a book that some of my friends have also been reading, and we have been discussing this book with each other. I think in the last 6-7 years, more than that, we have been discussing this book. So this book has stayed with me. There are such books that stay with you, even though it's not a work of fiction, it's not part of what we call literature. It's a book of political economy, it's a book on capitalism and how capitalism functions. But most important in the context of today's video, this is a book on the very logic of development, how it operates. How did it become part of our political common sense? How do we make sense of the predicament of those people who are facing hawker eviction drives, who are losing their means of subsistence? Or to go back a little in the trajectories of time, we should be asking, how did they come into being in the very first place? Why would these people, otherwise fairly intelligent, establish business ventures in government lands with this knowledge that someday or the other they might be suddenly removed from these locations? It is not the case that these people didn't know about such possibilities. Of course, they pulled some political strings here and there, somehow managed to run their businesses without getting interrupted by the government's desire to push ahead developmentalist schemes, through which they thought they would sanitize these spaces and let these spaces be utilized to nurture the larger logic of development through gaining of taxes. They knew about this possibility. Many of them saw this possibility. But they either did not want to believe that that possibility could someday become a reality, or they thought it would never happen. In all these cases, these people thought that it's some kind of a compulsion with which they would establish their businesses in these places. That is how they thought of their ventures. So the question, more important question that you need to be asking is this: where do these people come from? In economics, there is a term called unorganized sector. And in this Indian subcontinent, in this great nation of ours, much of what we call employment is occupied by the unorganized sector. Anybody who knows the basics of Indian economy would agree with this. It's only a very tiny fraction of the entire employment pie chart that can be classified as organized sector of the Indian economy. And within that organized sector, there's a large share of private capital, and only a very tiny fraction would belong to what we call public sector jobs, government jobs, whether state government or central government jobs, or PSUs, government aided institutions. That would be categorized as public sector jobs, falling within the larger category of organized sector jobs. So we are basically talking about a large majority of people who belong to what the middle class people have now started conveniently describing as the illegitimate occupants of these lands, and they should be removed. The other important question that we need to be asking is, where would these people go once they are driven away from the means of livelihood, the means of subsistence? Where would they go? So the first question is, where did they come from? How did they come from? And the second question is, where will they go? What would be their predicament once they have lost access to their means of subsistence almost suddenly out of nowhere? So let's get to the first question and see what Kullan Sharnal would be suggesting in response to the first question. As far as my reading of Sharnal's book goes, I think Sharnal talks about a category which was there in Marx's writings, Karl Marx's writings, in Karl Marx's analysis of capitalist economic production. But somehow that idea has not been adequately explored by Marx himself and the subsequent generations of Marxist thinkers across the globe. And this concept is that of surplus laborers. When Marx was talking about the idea of surplus laborers, the initial assumption was that the surplus laborers who were depeasantized, removed from the earlier means of subsistence in the tiny manufacturing units where they had ownership of means of production or their access to agricultural land, once you take those means of production away from them, or once you take their agricultural lands away from them, where do these people go? They become depeasantized, and they are now rendered with only their ability to sell their physical labor and nothing more than that. So that's the idea. That is the precondition of capitalist mode of production. You have to have wage labor, free wage labor. It is that kind of wage labor which would eventually be assimilated into the capitalist mode of production in terms of surplus value. But that is another kind of trajectory of analyzing capitalist mode of production. What is important is that through the original accumulation, the primitive accumulation method, capitalism brings about a radical disruption, a change in those lives of pre-capitalist people who are pushed into the domain of capitalism through primitive accumulation, and they lose their means of subsistence. They have now got only their labor to sell, nothing else. And that is the origin of surplus laborers, because capitalist mode of production cannot accommodate those depeasantized people in its capitalist mode of production. There is a limit to which capitalism can accommodate those earlier dispossessed people through primitive accumulation. Only a tiny number of percentage of those people can be now given jobs within what we call the organized sector, in the private sector primarily, the capitalist mode of production. The rest would constitute a large number of people who are now being touted as illegitimate occupants, hawkers, the vegetable vendors, the fruit sellers, the domestic laborers who come to our places to help us managing our households. All these people, those people who run tiny shops in front of the Sector 5 IT hubs, these are the people who constitute the unorganized sector. These are the people who can be described roughly as the surplus army of laborers, who have not been assimilated in any organized legal way by capitalism. And now they have nowhere to go. They cannot go back to the pre-capitalist past. They are not subsumed by capitalist mode of production. These are the people who somehow live in the urban slums that are now facing eviction. These are the people who operate as hawkers in railway stations, near railway stations, in different parts of the city, different parts of our urban life. So these are the people who had some means of subsistence in a pre-capitalist state of being, but now they are only laborers to be assimilated within the capitalist mode of production, but capitalism cannot assimilate all of them. Some of them will somehow fall by the wayside. They are the remainders of capitalist mode of production. Cole and Shannon would describe them as such. And it is these people who constitute the very domain of the so-called unorganized sector. Now, this is also a political question, because the political parties will now have to decide, especially the ruling party of the state, will have to decide how their government will manage the predicament of these people. Because clearly, this capitalist mode of production, this consumer-driven capitalism, which will be established in lieu of these people who were traditionally occupying those spaces, quote-unquote, illegally, where will they go? They cannot be accommodated within that capitalist mode of production. So some people will again fall by the wayside and add to the pain of the so-called surplus army of laborers who cannot be managed within the larger logic of developmentalism. So you give them some doles, you give them some cash transfers and expect that they would be somehow managed. That is exactly how populist politics operates. No matter what middle class meritocratic people think, the only method that we are left with, at least for the time being, is to give them such random populist kinds of help so that they somehow float. Right? So that is the situation that we are now facing. It is interesting to see, for us who are trying to analyze this situation, it will be interesting to see how the state government will be dealing with the political dimension of this situation. It's one thing to cater to your middle class support groups and to evict these hawkers and to show that the government is so decisively moving ahead in the paths of development. But it's another to manage these people politically, of course economically, but in this context politically. Conventional reminds us that these people, some of these people in different other parts of the globe, would either die of epidemics, famines, they would die in wars. But those things have considerably gone down. Of course, we are facing wars across the globe, but the colossal loss of lives that people could witness during the First World War, during the Second World War, are not happening, at least have not been happening for a long time, until this present cluster of wars started erupting. So where would these people go? They cannot die as cannon fodders. They do not die in situations of famine and epidemics, at least mostly. Where will these people go? They have lost their means of earlier means of pre-capitalist means of livelihood. They are depeasantized. But at the same time, they are not going to be entirely assimilated by the capitalist mode of production. But the same capitalist developmentalist mode of production and its ultimate support base, which is the state, that has removed them from even those means of livelihood that they had come up with in the unorganized sector. Where will these people go? It is this question that will keep bothering not only the present incumbent state government or other such governments across the Indian subcontinent, but also us, the middle class spectators of such eviction drives. I'll get back to all of you with more detailed analysis of these situations. We'll share more notes that I have taken out of my readings of Kollan Shandal's book and Partha Chatterjee's book, and share those derived thoughts with all of you. Thank you very much and good night.